Tonight we are honored with the presence of Dr. Kristen Andrews. Dr. Andrews is the York Research Chair in Animal Minds and the Associate Professor of Philosophy at York University in Toronto, where she also helps coordinate the Cognitive Science Program and the Toronto Area Animal Cognition Discussion Group. Professor Andrews is also on the board of directors of the Borneo Orangutan Society Canada and a member of the College of the Royal Society of Canada. A few of her currently taught courses consist of Animals and the Philosophy of Mind, The Meaning of Life, and Moral Psychology. Her most notable publications consist of a book on normative folk psychology, Do Apes Read Minds? Toward a New Folk Psychology, a book on animal minds titled The Animal Mind, An Introduction to the Philosophy of Animal Cognition, and her most recent co-authored publication, The Routledge Handbook of the Philosophy of Animal Minds. Tonight, Dr. Andrews will be discussing the normative cognition in great apes, and show us how we humans might not be the only life forms to possess normative thinking. Professor Andrews will guide us into the minds of our familiar mammal relatives through examining the cognitive capacities required for normative thinking. From comparing the presence of these cognitive capacities in great apes and that of the human infant, Dr. Andrews shows us how akin our mammal minds may truly be. Please join me in welcoming our guest speaker, Dr. Kristen Andrews.
Thank you, Gavin, for that nice, lovely introduction, and to Brian for the invitation, and for all of you for coming here. It's great to be here. I want to start by raising two familiar points that I think are widely accepted. One is that morality is a human universal. It's seen in every human culture that exists. At the same time, morality is unique to humans. We only see it in human cultures. We don't see it in any other animals. It's one of the things that makes us different from all other species. And in investigating these familiar claims, and in looking at morality across human cultures, psychologists have also been looking at the development of morality in children and finding that maybe it's not just universal across human cultures, but that it's maybe even innate. Maybe even babies in the first year of life are moral. So Paul Bloom, in his book, Just Babies, suggests that the origins of good and evil maybe are bred in the bone, that you can see glimmers of moral thought, moral judgment, and moral feeling even in the first year of life. These are quite some interesting claims. What makes Paul Bloom think that we might see moral behavior, morality, in infants? Well, his student, Kylie Hamlin, conducted a number of experiments where they showed babies videos and puppet shows. And I'll show you an example of one of those videos. So here's a video where you see this nice little circle wants to go up a hill, but can't quite get up the hill. Oh, and there's a helpful triangle coming up to help the circle get up the hill. In another video, the little circle's trying to get up the hill. Ooh, and then the mean square is going down and hindering. And then you've got a neutral stimulus here. So in these studies, what they find is that the babies prefer the helpers to the hinderers. If you give the baby a choice of playing with a puppet of the helpful triangle or the unhelpful square, they'll choose to play with the helpful triangle, not the unhelpful square. And if you give them a chance to give a cookie to one of the puppets, they'll give a cookie to the helpful triangle, not the hindering square. And sometimes they'll even punch the hindering square. They also seem to prefer it when the hindering square is punched by somebody else. So from a very early age, it seems like there's maybe some sensitivity to good actions and bad actions, and some preferences for what we might consider good actions and over bad actions. I want to show you an example of a subject taking this test. So that was the video. Here's the procedure. You'll see here the subject. I'm being shown this material. Oh, sorry, that's a chimpanzee. So the chimpanzee is shown that exact video. And here the chimpanzee is being given a choice to choose between the helper and the hinderer, or in this case, a hinderer and the neutral figure. And what the chimpanzees choose is the hinderer. The chimpanzees prefer the hinderer over the helper consistently. Why do the chimpanzees prefer the hinderer over the helper? Well, the researchers, Chris Crupenye and Brian Hare, suggest that the reason why the chimpanzees prefer the hinderers, to the helpers, is that the apes, it's bonobos, I'm so sorry, not chimpanzees. The bonobos prefer the hinderers to the helpers, is that dominance is really important to bonobos. And you prefer the action of the dominant individual. So there's still a view of a difference, a choice between this individual's actions and that individual's actions, but it's just reversed from the human case. It's not that children are naturally good and bonobos are naturally evil. It's that there are reasons for having these different preferences for one individual over another. A hinder is going to help you if you get the hinder on your side and you can gang up on everybody else in the group and you're a bonobo. And a helper is going to help you if you're a child and you want someone to help you do things. So it might be a cultural difference as opposed to a more innate moral difference. So this idea that morality is human unique suggests that apes are amoral. That apes are not moral agents. They're not good, or naturally bad. They're just neutral. They're outside of this domain of normativity in general. So at best, we can look at behaviors that chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans engage in and say that they might look like they're behaving in moral ways, but that's just because they're behaving in ways that in our human culture we would deem to be moral, not that they're acting correctly. However, there are some people who are challenging this idea and suggesting that, in fact, non-human great apes might be acting out of morality. So Frans de Waal is one example of a person like this, and refers to things like chimpanzees countenancing fairness norms, appreciating it better when resources are distributed equally as opposed to unequally. And we see that in that video that bonobos countenance dominance norms, prefer hinderers over helpers, the dominant over the subordinate. But there's reason to think that chimpanzees might lack third-party punishment. In fact, in captive experimental settings, we haven't found any evidence that chimpanzees are willing to punish somebody who didn't directly attack them. So chimpanzees will retaliate against someone who injures them. But if I'm a chimpanzee and I see you stealing from someone else or injuring someone else, even if it's my child, I don't really care. I don't punish. So what counts as morality? How can we even really try to answer this question about whether the ape's behavior just looks like morality or really is morality, if it's countenancing norms or acting from norms? And one helpful way of addressing this question, I think, is going back a couple thousand years to this ancient debate among two Confucian philosophers. And whether this is a debate or has been framed as a debate by more contemporary commentators on them is a question I won't get into. I'll present it as a debate because it's rhetorically useful for our purposes. So in this classic discussion, Mengzi argues that humans are naturally good. He said that all humans are born with the sprouts of goodness in them, and that what we need to do is work to develop these sprouts. We need to practice them, to cultivate them, the way we would cultivate any other seedling that grows. But we are all naturally born with these sorts of sprouts. This is why when we see the child fall in the well, we all care. We immediately want to do something to help. We have this affective emotional response. In contrast, Xunzi is arguing that humans are born naturally greedy. Humans are born naturally bad. Look at the infant, wanting food, attention, care, jealousy, greed, fighting. And in order to make humans good, what they need is a moral education. We need to sit down with our children. We need to demonstrate to them how to be good and how to be bad. So if we take this kind of caricature of these two views, with Mengzi, we have this idea that morality is something that is innate, is natural, and so maybe we should expect to see it in our closest relatives, and maybe we should expect to see it in babies. And Xunzi, if we take this perspective that morality is cultural, then maybe we should expect to see it only in cultural beings and only expect to see it after some sort of cultural training, enculturation practice. And so I want to go through both of these sort of perspectives to see what they can offer us in this question about whether or not humans are the only moral creature or not. So natural goodness, starting with the Mengzi approach, I think the current day Mengzi is Frans de Waal. So Frans de Waal, you may have run across him on NPR, read some of his books, watched his TED Talks. Frans de Waal argues that he's been studying chimpanzees and bonobos since the 70s and was one of the first person to be willing to discuss chimpanzees in terms of their kind of cultural dominance relationships, their helping behaviors, their cooperation behaviors. And he argues that chimpanzees and other great apes share some of these sentiments, moral sentiments with humans, as well as moral behaviors with humans. So it's not just looking at the behavior, but it's looking at the emotions as well. So, for example, de Waal argues that if you look at all of the social mammals, any social mammal that's been studied, we find that they all reconcile after fights, including the field bulls, including spotted hyenas and lions and dolphins and dwarf mongooses and the domestic goats will all, after a fight, make up. How do they make up? Well, it's described behaviorally, of course, with someone going and approaching the person the individual they had a fight with earlier, and engaging in more pro-social activity. So this reconciliation behavior is observed in social animals, but also sentiments of empathy, he argues, are found across social animals. In the monogamous prairie voles, we see them. We see empathy when the male and female are separated, and the females are stressed when they're separated, and then the male and the female are put back together. The male gets increased cortisol levels as well. The male responds empathetically to the female's stress, even though the male didn't observe it. He's responding to her. So these are the sorts of things that de Waal looks at, not just in the great apes, but in social animals more generally, to suggest that along with Mengzi, we see that there are these natural roots of morality, these little seedlings that exist in other social animals. And I think that it's not just Frans de Waal. I think Jonathan Haidt is also kind of a common day Mengzi. So Jonathan Haidt and his colleagues have worked on developing moral foundations theory using anthropological methods. They've looked across cultures to identify 5 or maybe 6 different moral foundations that are innate, they think, across cultures, psychological systems that are found across cultures in humans that form the foundation for our folk morality. And these are care for others, which comes from basic care of offspring, but you also see it in care between individuals who aren't related. Fairness and cheating. Loyalty and betrayal. Some respect of authority. And ideas of sanctity and degradation, purity. Now, I was interested in looking at these moral foundations in other non-human animals to see if they're also shared the way behaviors like reconciliation and emotions like empathy are shared across species. Haidt and his colleagues said that there's some evidence of continuity with the social psychology of humans and other primates, but they stop short from saying that there's any continuity when it comes to morality or moral foundations, and they're silent on issues of other non-human animals, just the primates. So with a postdoc and a grad student, Sara Vincent and Rebecca Ring, we looked to see whether these moral foundations can be found in chimpanzee behavior and in cetacean behavior. And lo and behold, we found some stuff. So I know the talk is supposed to be about primates, but I'll just say a tiny little bit about dolphins. Dolphins are hard to study. Whales and dolphins are hard to study because they swim and we don't swim as well as they do. So what we can see is from boats and using binoculars and things like that. But we have been able to identify a number of different moral foundations. In fact, I think that we've got the best evidence for care and harm. We see things like targeted helping and cetaceans. Cetaceans are well known for helping humans in distress, but they also help conspecifics who are in distress. You may have followed the case of the killer whale carrying her baby, her dead baby, for days and days on end to her own peril. Would be another example of a behavior that would fall into this care category. There's evidence of loyalty in cetaceans. The famous cases of cetacean self-beaching. If one individual beaches, the community will sometimes beach themselves in solidarity, and sometimes to the death of the entire community. And authority subversion is also found in cetaceans. And my favorite example of this is with a newly captive dolphin, bottlenose dolphin, taken from the Gulf of Mexico by Diana Reese and trained to eat dead fish. That's the first thing you do after you steal an animal, steal a dolphin from the water. You have to teach them how to eat dead fish. They don't know how to do that. So she taught Circe, she named the dolphin Circe, how to eat dead fish. She cut the fish in half and was feeding them. And Circe didn't like the tails, and they were too spiky. And so Diana said, like an indulgent mother, I trimmed the tails so that they weren't too spiky. And then Circe thought they were fine. That was great. So they came to this agreement. And the other thing that Diana Reese was doing was teaching basic husbandry maneuvers and training Circe. And one of the things you do when you're training a dolphin is you have to tell them when they got it wrong, right? If they do something wrong, you have to indicate that. And the way it's indicated is with a timeout, which is the same sort of thing you'd see in many other sorts of training, humans and non-humans alike. But a dolphin timeout is like this. So if you're doing something wrong right now, I do this for like 1 minute. So I just step back, withdraw, and then don't look at you. And so Circe quickly learned that that a timeout meant that she got it wrong and she had to try something else. So anyway, that's all the background. The authority subversion, the sort of punishment case, was when one day Diana reports she was feeding Circe fish, and Circe spit out the fish and got in an upright bodily posture like this, which is very weird for a dolphin because dolphins are like this all the time. And Diana said, oh, it looks like she's giving me a timeout. And then she looked at the fish that was spit out, and it was a spiny tail that hadn't been trimmed. So she said, oh, Circe's punishing me and telling me I did it wrong. So she decided, she was working on her dissertation at the time, and she decided to run a study as part of her dissertation research and just occasionally feed Cersei untrimmed tails. Every time she fed Cersei an untrimmed tail, she got a time out from her. So this message was used to punish Diana Reese, tell her she got it wrong. So these are the sorts of examples in the paper with Rebecca and Sara. We go through all the data that exists that we could find in support of these sorts of moral foundations in dolphins. In chimpanzees, there's a lot more research. Chimpanzees spend a lot of time on the ground. We can follow them more easily, and we can follow dolphins. And we see evidence for almost all of the moral foundations, except not so much for sanctity degradation. There are some anecdotal stories about captive chimpanzees who do not like to touch bedding with feces on it. But chimpanzees also will throw feces and touch it. So it's not clear whether there's any kind of purity, sanctity degradation, but there's certainly authority subversion and loyalty and betrayal, and we'll get into some of those examples later on. But I just want to point out, anyone who's followed Jonathan Haidt's work on the moral foundations of liberals and conservatives, has anyone followed this? He's looked to see whether there are differences between liberals and their moral foundations in the US and conservatives. And he finds that there are quite stark differences. What are the differences? Liberals care most about care and harm and fairness and cheating, whereas conservatives care about authority, subversion, loyalty, and betrayal, sanctity and degradation, as well as care and fairness. So what it looks like to me is that the chimpanzees are resembling conservative Americans in their moral foundations. It's not that, they don't have them all, so it's not good enough. No, they almost have all the ones that the Republicans have. That's pretty good for moral foundations. Something. So is it morality? Is this morality, moral foundations? I mean, Haidt doesn't himself say this is morality, but these are cognitive mechanisms that are used for in these moral systems that we see across cultures. So maybe it's not enough to just have these moral foundations. We have this philosophical question of how we get from the moral foundations to full-blown morality. What do you need to bridge that gap, if anything? What do you need to get from moral sentiments, empathy and emotion for others, care, to full-blown morality? What's missing? And a common answer to what's missing is, well, you need to have principles. Morality is a system of principles. It tells you how you should act. And the principles are based in the moral foundations, in the sentiments, but that's what you need for a full-blown moral system. And if that's the case, then this is why we need to look at cultural goodness. This is what Shunza had in mind, that it's not enough to just be natural, because sure, we might care when the baby falls in the well, but we also might want to steal all the baby's snacks when the baby's in the well too. Right? Our natural sentiments can go both ways, and our human nature isn't going to be good. It's goodness. The goodness of humans comes from artifice. Right? So he describes how humans have fought against the natural ever since we started culture. How did we fight against the natural? Well, we started cultivating the land. We started making predictions about seasons. We started planting plants in the right time in order to reap the benefits of them. We started domesticating animals and breeding animals. All of the stuff we did to make the world more predictable is artifice, is not natural. The natural is terrible. We're terrified of it. It kills us. We die at like 10 years old. The unnatural is great. Right? Natural food, you know what natural food is? Like at the market, you go to the natural food. That's not natural. That's like the most artificial stuff you could get. Processed, granola bars and whatnot. I don't even know how to say acai bowls. That's like what you guys eat here. What is that? Is that real? Is that a real food? I don't know. Yogurt is not natural. Yogurt is really weird. You milk a cow, and then you let this milk sit there in the sun until it gets yucky. Very artificial. So this is Shunza's view. When you are doing anything, any sort of processing, it's not natural. And not natural is great. That's what we want. Natural childbirth, you know what that is? It's not like lavender oil and doulas. Natural childbirth is going outside and squatting in the ground and then letting the baby come and chewing the cord off. Like that's not great. Nobody wants to do that. So my point is that that Shunza thinks that we need to change what's natural in order to get to goodness. And by doing that, we tame the world and we make it more predictable. And when we look at norms, when we look at morality and social living and how we solve this problem of living together in groups, what I think we see is a kind of artifice that we've introduced. And we maybe didn't introduce this the way a scientist would introduce some artifice, but probably introduced it the same way a lot of our cultural innovations were introduced. We tried stuff out and it worked. So the artifice of norms, I think, is exactly what we need in order to bridge the gap from the natural moral foundations and natural sentiments to something that might look like full-blown morality or normative practice. So Cristina Bicciari gives us a definition of what counts as a social norm. And there are lots of definitions of social norms out there, but I like hers because it kind of integrates a number of different ideas that exist there in the literature. So she writes in her work, a social norm is a rule of behavior such that individuals prefer to conform to it on condition that they believe that A, most people in their reference network, in their community, conform to it, and B, most people believe that most people in their community believe that they ought to conform to it. So it's a belief about what people will do and what people believe. A belief about what people will do and a belief about what people will believe. So that's kind of a high standard because you have to have the ability to believe something about other people's beliefs. Believe thing about the beliefs in other people in your community. And as a requirement for social norms, that would then say, in order to have a norm, you need to be a mind reader. You need to have a theory of mind. You need to be able to attribute propositional attitudes, beliefs and desires to other agents. And this is something that human children don't seem to be able to do reliably until 4, maybe 7, depending on what kind of studies you're looking at. And it's something that non-human animals don't seem to be particularly great at, but we'll look at that question in a little bit. And it's also maybe something we don't do when we're following our own human social norms, right? So think of examples where we have a social norm in the sense that it seems like a social norm. We expect people to behave in this way, and when people don't behave in this way, we're surprised, and we think other people will expect us to act in this way if you ask them, but you don't even notice you're doing it, right? Things like, say, how to greet somebody in your culture. So how do you greet somebody? If you've always grown up in a place where people hug, you see someone you haven't seen, you hug them, there's no question. But then you go into another culture, you move from the South to Toronto, and then you try to hug somebody, and they say, oh, get away from me. Why are you attacking me? Or you go to France and people start kissing you on the cheek, and you don't know how to kiss them on the cheek, and then you spread your lipstick all over their face accidentally because you kissed them wrong. It's so embarrassing. So there are all these kind of social norms that we have that we might not even recognize. And one of my favorite is talking distance norms. So we know how far to stand away from someone in our own culture when we talk to them. But when we move to another culture, we might have zero idea how far or how close to stand. And people might stand way too close to us and make us feel uncomfortable, and we step back. Or someone might stand too far away from us, and we feel as if they are unengaged with us. And this is a norm. It seems like something we'd want to call a norm. It's an expectation. It's an expectation that has consequences when it's violated. But it's not something that we formulate beliefs about or attribute beliefs about to others in our community. You probably never knew. See, I always have to check and see what it is. you probably never knew that in order to be in the intimate zone in North America, you have to be between 6 and 18 inches away from someone. So you're not probably attributing a belief to someone you're in the intimate zone with, that your partner believes that they're 6 to 18 inches away from you, whatever the number is. If that's right, if there are things that we want to count as social norms but don't require mind reading, I think we need another account of social norm. And so I want to propose a variation on Bicchiari's account of social norms that gets rid of the mind reading requirement but keeps in all the rest. So basically the idea is that there's a pattern of behavior in place. Individuals choose to conform to the pattern of behavior, and individuals expect that others in their community will also conform, and they'll sanction, punish others who don't conform. And if you have those criteria met, then you have a social norm. You have something that's going to be socially learned and transmitted. You'll have conformity in the culture. You'll have something that looks like a principle, even if the principle is not something that can be explicitly stated or isn't explicitly taught. You still have a principle there that can be part of your cultural inheritance. So then, with this framework in place, we can ask the question whether we can see any animal social norms in any non-human animals. And in great apes, we can look for things. I think that there are a number of potential things, potential places where we can look for candidate animal social norms. In chimpanzees, there's a prohibition against infanticide. Infanticide happens sometimes, but when it happens, chimpanzees get very upset. This is an example. This is the first observation, photographed observation of infanticide in a chimpanzee. It was just 2 years ago. And the chimpanzee male ate the infant, and the community members kind of went berserk. But the scientists couldn't observe exactly what was happening, such that they weren't in a position to determine whether it counts as an animal social norm or not. So looking for the responses of the other individuals, did it count as a sanction? Was there some sort of punishment, or did everyone just go nuts because it was a highly aversive or highly exciting event? We don't know. But that would be one place to look. Another place to look is in the preferential treatment of infants. So chimpanzees have a hierarchical social structure, and once you're a juvenile male, you're not allowed to do a lot of things. But if you're an infant, you can get away with anything. You can climb on the alpha male, you can steal food from the alpha male, and it's tolerated. As soon as you hit puberty, that's all over. So are there animal social norms? Is there something that fit that pattern with that sort of behavior that exists? And we can also look at some of these other examples. Resource distribution is another one I wanted to show you just as a brief example. It's not chimpanzees, but these are vervet monkeys. This was a study done by Erica van der Waal, who was looking at transmission of cultural behavior between mother and infant in a vervet monkey in 4 vervet monkey communities. And what she did was she got this corn and dyed some corn pink and some corn blue. And in 2 of the communities, she also put quinine in the blue corn. In the other 2 communities, she put quinine in the pink corn when she introduced it to the mother. So the mothers were able to sample the 2 colors. They developed a food preference that became very stable. So they took the quinine away, and you still saw preferences for pink corn in 2 communities and blue corn in the other 2 communities. Then the babies were born. And what did the babies do? They imitated the mom. They acquired the same preferences as the mom, which was what she was originally studying. But this is when science gets so exciting, because male vervet monkeys immigrate. And what these monkeys did is the blue corn eating monkeys migrated to the pink corn communities, and the pink corn eating monkeys migrated to the blue corn eating communities. And then what did they do? They all switched their preference. All right, so they switched eating something that they knew was healthy, that they knew was beneficial, that there was no competition for, in order to compete to eat a scarce resource just because everybody else was doing it. If that's not a social norm, I don't know what is. There only was one monkey that didn't switch, and he became alpha right away of that new group. So these are the sorts of things that where we could look for potential social norms. Now, there's some limitations of looking for animal social norms in this sort of approach, looking for these rules, and that is how do we see expectations and how do we see sanctions? We can gather evidence that other apes, other animals have expectations if they're able to coordinate successfully with one another. That's suggestive that there are expectations there. Sanctions are even harder because I don't think sanctions are limited to punishment. We often talk about sanctions in terms of a punishment as in like a hitting, like you hurt someone else and I'm going to go beat you up because you hurt somebody. In our culture, we might lock somebody up or something. But sanctions take a lot less visible form than that, especially when the person who's doing the sanctioning is not in a position of power, when that person is weak. What do you do to punish someone or to sanction someone when you're a weak person and they're a strong person? I think we've recently seen examples of this in the Me Too movement. Like a lot of women who weren't willing to come out and say that Harvey Weinstein was sexually harassing me, raping me, because he's got the power. And if I say that, my career's over. So I can't say that. So what do I do? Well, what do you do when you're in that position? You warn your friends, don't go to Harvey Weinstein's room. You stay away from Harvey Weinstein. You withdraw yourself. There are all these more subtle actions that one takes in order to sanction a norm violator when you're not in a position of power to do something visible and punish someone else. And I think that's what's been missing from some of this analysis of punishment in the field. We need to recognize the role of power in great apes as well as in human great apes. So while we can look for animal social norms in the ways I suggest by looking at candidate behaviors and seeing if it fits this definition of animal social norm, another thing we could do is look to see whether there's evidence of the cognitive capacities that are needed to have social norms. And this is where I want to argue that social cognition is really a form of normative cognition. And by social cognition, I'm talking about the kind of social cognition that humans and great apes share, not the kind of social cognition that eusocial insects like ants or honeybees have, but a specifically primate kind of social cognition. And a common way of talking about social cognition or how we understand other people goes back to this idea that was introduced in Bicchiari's account of what a social norm is and her definition. In order to understand someone, we have to know what they believe and what they desire. And then from figuring out what people believe and what they desire, then we can figure out what they're going to do. It's kind of a little deduction. Oh, if you believe that there's beer in the refrigerator and you desire the beer, then I can predict that you're going to go to the refrigerator. And this has been a very simple and very powerful idea in philosophy and in psychology for a number of years. But I think it certainly oversimplifies what humans are doing and what great apes are doing when they're engaged in social cognition. So I've been trying to generate a list of other ways in which we engage in social cognition, other ways that we're able to predict behavior, other ways we explain individuals' behavior rather than just mind reading, thinking about what others believe and what others desire. Other ways that we make predictions and understand and explain would be through things like self-reference. Oh, well, what would I do in this situation? Oh, I'm having a bunch of people to come to a talk. What would they like? Would they like the room really cold? I'd like the room really cold, so I think they would too, and I make the room really cold. It doesn't always work, but we do this. There's social psychology data on the fact that we, in fact, do make generalizations from self. Stereotypes, we use stereotypes. and stereotypes about all sorts of groups, social role groups, as well as the familiar ones that we all don't like so much, like race and gender. But we use stereotypes to do things like predict that the taxi driver is the person to ask where the street is. We don't know the taxi driver, but the taxi driver has the role of knowing how to get around, and so we can make the prediction that the taxi driver would probably be better than, say, the teenager walking down the street or the bicyclist, in telling us how to get where we're going. So all of these different ways, there's a whole host of them that I discussed, are used by humans and by non-humans in order to understand one another. One of them that's really important is following norms. So we have norms of behavior, rules of behavior. How are you supposed to act when you're at a talk? Are you supposed to get up and start dancing right now? If you did that, would people look at you askance? Would Brian escort you out of the room as a naughty audience member? If you started throwing things at me, right? If I started dancing, there's no piano. No, we have these normal expectations. What time did the talk start? 4:15? Right, so blah, 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 blah. We have these expectations about what you're supposed to do in certain contexts, and those are normative expectations. And we do a lot of work predicting what people are going to do by expecting students to come to class on time, teachers to do the grading on time, kind of, right? Following the norms more or less. So given these sorts of methods of prediction, this pluralism, what we see is that I think animal social norms reflects social cognition more generally when we understand it in this pluralistic way. That there's a pattern of behavior in place and that we can predict what others are going to do based on these patterns of behavior that we've created and that we reinforce by predicting that someone is going to engage in the expected behavior. When people don't engage in the expected behavior, they get sanctioned, right? When the students don't show up on time, the teacher said, "Why are you late? Why are you walking in late? What's the problem?" When someone doesn't come to your birthday party, your friend doesn't come to your birthday party, you wonder, do they hate me? What's going on? Or are they hurt? So we form a lot of our social cognitive capacities are based on expectations that are reinforced when we are able to coordinate and that are undermined when the coordinations don't happen. And so this is where I think we can identify the kind of cognitive capacities that help us develop both the normative cognition and the social cognition capacities. And the first one is very simple, low-level identification of something as an agent. This is not an agent. It's very clear, but things that move in certain ways, in certain rational, intentional ways, we can identify as agents, and we see this in babies at a very early age and in great apes. How much time do I have? I think my timing is off.
Got about another, it's 5:15 would be an hour.
Okay. So identification of agents is a very basic, easy one. Sensitivity to in-group and out-group is something that's a little bit more complex. We see it developing in human children in the first year of life. We know that infants prefer same race faces over different unusual race faces. So it means that if you're raised, in the studies, it's a white infant with white people around them, and then they see a face that isn't white, they don't prefer that. They don't like to look at that as much as they like to look at their own race faces. We see this in great apes as well, sensitivity to in-group and out-group. I'll give you an example in just a minute. The third one is social learning of the group traditions. So if there are these group practices, eat blue corn here. That's what we do. Other individuals learn that tradition. We see that in humans as well as non-humans. And consciousness of appropriateness, some sort of sense that this is right or this is wrong, and the sense that it's wrong is what is going to lead to the sanction or the punishment. So I'm going to skip, I was going to go through this in children. I'm going to skip that so that we can look at it in great apes, which is what we're all here for, right? So what's the evidence of these sorts of capacities in non-human great apes? Well, first of all, ape identification of agents. So I said back at the beginning that there's been a long concern that great apes don't mind read, they don't have a theory of mind, they don't attribute beliefs to one another. And the main test for theory of mind was something called the false belief test. This is the false belief test. And a false belief test goes like this. A subject, this is for humans, the version for humans. A kid is looking at a puppet show, and Sally comes into the room and says, I'm going to hide my chocolate in the box. And then Sally leaves the room, and then Anne comes in and she says, oh, look, there's chocolate in the box. She takes it out of the box, she puts it in a cupboard, and then she leaves. And then Sally comes back in the room and says, I'm going to get my chocolate now. And then the puppet show ends, and the child is asked, where's Sally going to go to look for her chocolate? And kids younger than 4 tend to say, she's going to go look for it in the cupboard. And you ask them why, and they say, because that's where it is. Why would she go anywhere else? But older children recognize that Sally would go and look for the chocolate in the box. Why? Yeah, because that's where she left it. Except the psychologists and philosophers all say, because that's where she believes it is. But when you ask the subjects why, they always say, because that's where she left it. Yeah. So anyway, take that for what it is. So this test has been seen as a litmus test for a theory of mind. I have my skepticism about this. And chimpanzees never passed a version of this test. For 40 years of trying to get a chimpanzee to pass a test like this, they failed until just very, very recently, until 2016. So Chris Crepenier and colleagues showed not a Sally Ann task, because you know what? Chimpanzees don't care about where chocolate is. You know what chimpanzees care about? Violence. They were shown these videos. So King Kong attacks this human. The human comes out with a bat, and the human goes, oh, wow, King Kong ran into the leftmost haystack. I'm going to go beat him there and get him. So these are just the habituation videos. The red dots are eye tracker technology, and the chimpanzee is up in the corner looking at the screen. So what we see is that the chimpanzee gets used to this idea that the human wants to attack the King Kong because King Kong is very violent and terrible and attacking him. In this case, this was the false belief test? No. Yeah, so here's a false belief test. Maybe that one was too. And I was talking. So the human's there looking for the chimpanzee, looking for King Kong. King Kong comes, attacks him, comes out with his stick, goes in one haystack, and he gets beaten. Now, let's see. Anyway, the test condition, which I guess I missed when he went through this, is when the King Kong moves from one haystack to another, when the human is behind the closed door to get his stick. And what the chimpanzees do with the eye tracking is they look at the haystack where the human last saw the chimpanzee, or the King Kong. So in this case, he moved, and the chimpanzee, the subjects are looking more often at the haystack in which the human last saw the King Kong, as opposed to the haystack where the King Kong most recently was. And so this is interpreted by the researchers as evidence that chimpanzees, also bonobos and orangutans who took this test, as having a theory of mind, understanding that the human has a false belief. That's a lot of heavyweight cognitive material to attribute to this finding, and I've written some criticisms of that interpretation. But at the very least, it's really good evidence that chimpanzees understand something about intentional action. That's what they understand. And can identify an agent as someone who can act and predict what the agent's going to do. Also, the helpers and hinders study I showed you at the beginning, another example of identification of agents. But more interestingly, moving on to the second criterion of naive normativity, in-group, out-group sensitivity, wild chimpanzees have territories. And some wild chimpanzees like to hunt monkeys to eat. And some wild chimpanzee territories hunt their monkeys to extinction, and then they need more territory. But other chimpanzees live in the other territory. And so they go on boundary patrols, and then they go into incursions into the new territory, and then they kill or castrate males, and they kill infants, and they steal females, and they increase their territory, and then they have more monkeys to hunt. So this community of chimpanzees is one of the largest communities because they continue expanding their territory. So this is, if war isn't evidence of in-group, out-group thinking, I don't know what is. There's also a lot of work that's been done on social learning of group traditions. Vicky Horner and Andy Whiten and a number of other people, including Frans de Waal, have been involved in these sorts of studies where there's captive chimpanzees are offered a puzzle box with food inside. And there are two ways to open it. And one way is taught to an alpha female in the group. And so she learns that way. And then a beta female observes the alpha female opening the box. And so she opens it the way the alpha female opens it. And then C chimpanzee sees B chimpanzee open the box in the same way. And the behavior spreads through the whole community, opening the box in the one way. Whereas in another community of chimpanzees, the different way of operating the box was demonstrated and learned and spread throughout the community. So even when chimpanzees find out that you can open the box in a different way, they don't care. They choose to do it in their culture's way, in the way their group does it. And it's not just puzzle boxes, and it's not just in captive communities. We saw it in the blue, pink corn. But another one of my favorite examples is this like cool decoration behavior of these chimpanzees in this one community started putting straw in their ear. The alpha female put a piece of straw in her ear, and then everyone was doing it. Nobody knows why. Some people say, well, maybe it feels good. But when she died and stopped doing it, everyone else stopped doing it too. So maybe it didn't feel that good. And then what about sanctions or consciousness of appropriateness? Well, just like I told you that the young infants really liked it when the hinders got beaten up, the hinder puppets got beaten up by someone else, chimpanzees are also interested when antisocial individuals get punished. So in this very recent study, both preschool children and chimpanzees were shown antisocial behavior, and they were also shown neutral behavior. And then the individual actor was punished, was beaten up. But then they moved around a corner, and the chimpanzee had to open up a heavy door to see what was going on. They only opened up the heavy door to watch the punishment when the person had engaged in antisocial behavior, not neutral behavior. So they worked to see the wrongdoer get punished. And that's one of the best examples we have right now in a captive sort of setting of chimpanzees caring about sanctioning behavior. Not sanctioning on their own, but caring about seeing a wrongdoer be sanctioned. From the field, there are reports of punishment, but these haven't been replicated in a lab setting. So I think that there's really good evidence that apes have normative cognition to a certain extent. And if apes have normative cognition, and if apes have kind of natural sentiments and moral foundations, then apes have core elements from both the kind of natural set and the cultural set. Now this makes me really want to revisit our two familiar claims we started with. If morality is a human universal, that is, if it's the case really that all humans across cultures have morality, even if they don't teach it, even if they don't talk about it, and if humans had it throughout our evolutionary history since we were Homo, then I think there's really good reason to think that morality is not unique to humans, because we see these elements of natural behaviors and sentiments and moral cognition and cultural transmission, on the other hand, in our non-human relatives. So I will stop there. Thanks for your attention.